origin of the Menominee people goes back thousands of years, and it took place at the mouth of the Menominee River. It was handed down through oral history by our ancestors and our elders. And it was here at the Menominee River that the Great Bear emerged from the Menominee River. And the Creator saw him, and it was the first Menominee. He transformed the bear into human form. As the bear didn't want to be alone, he called the eagle flying above, "Brother Eagle, come down, be my brother." The eagle descended and started walking with the bear up the river. And the Creator too transformed him into human form and was a second Menominee.
Most of the ethnographic and ethnohistorical accounts about the Menominee origins are very consistent from one case to the next. There has always been this focus on the mouth of the Menominee River, and regardless of how one interprets those origin stories on the part of the tribe, they were recorded by Hoffman back in the 1890s and by Felix Keesing and by C.C. Trowbridge, the Indian agent at Green Bay in the 1820s, and countless others. Their origin story and their link to this landscape is very well established.
The Menominees occupied over 10 million acres of land. And I say occupy because we did not own the land. It was our philosophy that we only lived on the land and used only what we needed, what the Creator had left for us in forms of food and shelter. The earthworks, the mounds, the burial sites, the garden beds were made by our ancestors of the Menominee people. And we believe that over the years there were changes in our lives, and that burying our dead in these mounds were part of the life cycle that we had. We believe they're culturally spiritual to us.
Well, I think they said something about the distant past, the cultural practices of the indigenous populations in North America. And there were, from the early excavations that took place, there were all kinds of exotic commodities that were often found as grave goods. For example, one of the sites in Ohio, one of the Hopewell mounds, had a large amount of obsidian that had been brought great distances from the Northwest to be buried in Ohio with some status individuals. So I think there was fascination that was based on kind of things that were occurring in these mounds. Sub-mound chambers and crypts. They were monuments that were constructed for a multitude of purposes, including disposition of the deceased.
I believe our ancestors played a big part of creating these earthworks, the mounds and burial sites, garden beds, storage pits. And we see that evidence here on the Menominee Reservation. It wasn't until 1634 and prior to that, one of our Menominee elders had a dream that over the Bay of Green Bay, a large boat would come over the bay. Within that boat would be light-skinned people that would change our lives forever. Right after the migration of Europeans here, they brought a lot of things with them as far as trade items, but they also brought disease to us. Some of that being smallpox was a big one. We did lose a lot of our people through smallpox, through cholera.
There are certainly any number of historical accounts of major population declines with various epidemics of smallpox. And it affected the Menominee people much as it affected others who came into contact with Europeans early on. The collapse of populations was so dire in many instances that it began a pattern of what anthropologists often refer to as pan-Indianism, where people from different ethnicities, different ethnic groups, were forced to band together and intermarry to maintain viable societies. So I think that was the major effect, is that this rapid population decline with disease vectors forced them to modify their long-standing approaches to the world.
I think it's important that we continue to tell the story, the beginning of our tribe, especially to our youth of our tribe need to know about how we came about, where we come from. The Menominee people have lived in this area for over 10,000 years. We're indigenous to what is now Wisconsin. We've always been here. We don't have a migration story. Our creation story, our beginning took place at the mouth of the Menominee River.
What we're doing is approaching the outdoor exhibit that we've started here in the museum grounds. It's a replica of a bark lodge that was photographed in 1925 by Samuel Barrett from the Milwaukee Public Museum and Alonzo Skinner, who were up here on the reservation collecting ethnological specimens. We thought it would be a good opportunity on the grounds for Menominee residents who live here on the reservation to be able to actually experience what a domestic setting looked like back at the turn of the century. And we assume that these were the same kind of structures that were made here in late prehistoric times. We've also got a reconstructed ridged agricultural field that's based on a garden and a brush fence that was recorded in Sheboygan County, somewhere south of here, but where they actually show the Menominee wigwams and the garden areas next to them. So we've tried to replicate this and stay as close as we can to the reality that we've got. From our archaeological research, we've recovered phytoliths from corn, beans, and squash, and those things are all growing in the garden.
Knippoi village is named after one of our chiefs Knippoi, and it was Knippoi's band. After the reservation was established, he moved his band up to an area called West Branch, and it was here that Knippoi settled along with several of the families in his band, lived a good life there. He was part of the Christian chiefs of our people. Soon after, there was a church that was built in the West Branch area. But the band up there, they practice a lot of agriculture. Also are hunters and gatherers, but for the most part settled in that area.
One of the reasons that we got focused on Knippoi's village, because based on the preliminary work that we did at a variety of sites on the reservation, we really didn't have a good model of what one of these prehistoric communities would have looked like. So Knippoi's settlement was largely abandoned. The houses were left to deteriorate. Today at Knippoi's village, there are berms from the house structures, grave sites, former clearings, and we thought it was worthwhile to go out and do an on-the-ground survey and plot the locations of all the homesteads in Knippoi's village. And then we integrated the archaeological data we had collected with oral histories. So what we wound up with at Knippoi's village was a model that has yet to be tested against sites that are late prehistoric, like the Joe Dick Road site, Big Eddy West, and others on the reservation, and many areas outside of the Menominee Reservation. All right, we are sitting in a former excavation that we've reopened, and the reason we've reopened this excavation is to collect additional charcoal samples from underneath the planting surfaces of the garden beds. Well, these garden beds were really just an accidental discovery. We were told by some elders and people familiar with this part of the area that up the creek that bisects this 20-acre plot of raised agricultural fields, that there were some mounds up here. And so walking through, they're so well defined that Larry Meyer and the crew actually found these beds. One of the reasons we were so impressed is, one, they're very well defined, and two, the size of this suggests, again, some kind of community initiative that one or two people couldn't clear 20 acres and plant an area that size. The soils that we're perched on right now are glacial outwash soils. They're sandy, but there's a large component of gravel, and it's very droughty stuff. This would be the last kind of place that I would imagine people would modify for agricultural purposes. You get into the subsoil, and it's very coarse, sandy material with lots and lots of gravel in it. It's stuff that's very rapidly drained, so it doesn't hold moisture very long. And that's, again, part of the function, perhaps, of these raised agricultural fields is a way of managing moisture. The moisture collects in the ditches and resides there. It would be available for the roots to the plant. So what you tend to get is a fairly thin organic layer, about maybe 10 to 15 centimeters on the upper part of the ridge. And then on the ditches, the organic material dips down quite well below the planting surfaces, so that it's almost like a reverse kind of orientation where there's a dip where the ditches are dug and then a peak where the ridges are. And the assumption is that the people who were cultivating these things would hoe up composted material out of the ditches and wet material onto the planting surfaces. It's never been suggested with any sense of vigor that the Menominees were very sophisticated agriculturalists. Most of the government records that talk about attempts at agriculture on the reservation suggest that at best the Menominee were reluctant farmers. Some of these things I think were political, and some I think were just a lack of knowledge on the people who were trying to impress upon them an agrarian system with draft animals and clear plowing that was totally alien to the landscape and the hundreds of years that they had already been pursuing this very successful pattern of sustainable organic agriculture, which is one of the keystones of Menominee culture. We know that on the Menominee Reservation, the tribe's ancestors began planting and developing these raised fields shortly after about 750 AD, and they persisted all the way through the Little Ice Age, the 13, 14, 1500 era, right into historic times, this site being 1650 AD. The charcoal that's so ubiquitous or commonplace underneath these, we think is part of the process. Before they prepared the beds, it looks like they cut small ditches periodically down at this level and burned material to start the process, then built the beds on top of them. The people that built these agricultural fields modified and amended what people think of as pretty poor agricultural soils. One of the interesting things we see is that the soil characteristics are very, very different from undisturbed soils in the forest. They were modifying this landscape both in a figurative sense with the ditches and ridges, but also in a chemical sense with the incredible increase of organic content and providing nutrient to the plants that were growing. Oneota is actually a term that refers to the former name of the Upper Iowa River in Iowa. Most broadly used, it refers to a series of cultural traditions where the keystone of material culture is shell-tempered pottery that's designed in certain ways, and it's often associated with intensive corn horticulture. We do find shell-tempered pottery that I would contend begins to occur on this landscape as early as 900 to 1000 AD. What we find is Oneota pottery by every standard of the definition in association with local woodland pottery that had been manufactured for several hundreds of years. I find it curious, and suggested this some years ago, that it may actually represent part of the Menominee creation narrative, where the Thunderers who come from the south and bring with them the gift of corn. I suspect that it's these Thunderers that are the folks who are manufacturing this shell-tempered pottery.
After the establishment of the Menominee Reservation in the 1854 treaty that was signed at Kashina Falls, not far from here, it was the head chief of our tribe at the time. His name was Oshkosh. And Oshkosh, seeing the wealth of the natural resources we had here, what the government didn't want was a place called wilderness, and that was this reservation. And nobody wanted to live here but Oshkosh. He said, my people have lived in this area for centuries. We know this area, let me move my people there, in which the government let us move to this reservation, part of our ancestral territory. And it was here, the wilderness was the trees, what nobody else wanted. And Oshkosh had said, well, we can make use of these trees. The trees are culturally and spiritually significant to us. We've been around them for centuries. What we can do is we see people using them for building their log homes and whatever else. We can do that, and we can do this in a manner that will not harm the population of the trees.
It's no secret that the tribe is world-renowned for their forestry practices. And again, it's part of this notion of sustainable lifeways and managing your landscape. I'm not certain of the details of this, but it's been related to me on many occasions that when the Menominee took occupancy of this reservation after the Treaty of Wolf River in 1854, that Chief Oshkosh said that this is the key to our survival. We are going to manage this forest. We're going to start at one end of the reservation, and we're only going to take a few trees and the diseased trees, and we're never going to just level this forest. And when we get to one end, we're going to turn around and start over again, and that way there will always be a forest for the Menominee to manage.
Their relationship to this habitat was based not only on agriculture, of course, they're also harvesting wild rice and many other plant products, the fisheries. We're no more than a few hundred yards from the Wolf River, and that Wolf River provided the residents of this region with an annual bounty of protein based on the sturgeon runs and other species of spawning fish. What's so phenomenal about this area, the Menominee Reservation, as well as some areas north of here up along the Menominee River, is that there are large tracts of these things that are still intact and undisturbed. And we can look at them from a surface perspective. Most all of these garden beds have been destroyed by contemporary agricultural practices and grading and paving and building and those types of things.
The largest concentration of raised agricultural fields are within that landscape where the Menominee claim their origins occurred, in the Menominee River Valley. So you have literally miles of raised agricultural fields interspersed with mound groups and domestic structures, and a material culture from the limited excavations that have been done there that are virtually identical to what we find here on the Menominee Reservation. So I think there's a very strong link there.
The National Historic Preservation Act is very important to the Menominee people. I work a lot with the NHPA because I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. And what that does for the Menominee people, it gives us a chance to preserve our cultural resources, because if there is a federal undertaking here on the reservation, if a project uses federal funds, if the project occurs on trust land or uses federal permit, then the federal agency has to assess historic properties in consultation with the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer.
Without the protection of the National Historic Preservation Act, many sites would have been simply removed for construction projects like road building, for example. What the Preservation Act really did was it forced any federally licensed, funded, or regulated undertaking to consider the impact or the effect on the cultural resources of not only the indigenous people, but also more recent sites. Not all sites are protected, but they're all evaluated to determine whether or not they are significant and what they can teach us about our own heritage as well as the heritage of indigenous people. Well, it was not too many years ago that after a state historic preservation officer was appointed for each state in the country, that tribes began to become more involved in the decision-making process. And because of their sovereignty, each tribe has established a historic preservation officer, and that tribal historic preservation officer has the same standing with federal agencies that the state historic preservation officer does. He or she makes decisions about the significance of sites, not only within their tribal lands that they occupy today, but also lands that may have been culturally affiliated or part of the ceded territories of the government. So it's given the tribes, I think, a much more significant voice in participating in the decision-making process.
When I first started, I really didn't know much about archaeology. I really didn't trust archaeologists because I just thought they came in and dug up the ground and took the resource. And that was the farthest from the truth. After starting to work with the archaeologist and Dr. Overstreet, there was an understanding of cultural sensitivity from not only from Dr. Overstreet, but other archaeologists that worked here. They helped soften the idea that archaeologists aren't here to just dig. They're here to help preserve the past.
I think in many instances there's been a real perception on the part of Native Americans that archaeologists and others were not necessarily respectful of their cultures and traditions, were oftentimes focused on their own research rather than on the way in which the activities they were carrying out would affect the people in the communities that were being studied. I'd like to think that we've come a long way since the mid-19th century, keeping in mind that the notions of the mid-19th century on the part of academics who felt, in many instances, that indigenous people were not capable of constructing these complex earthworks and things, and so they assigned the authorship of the mounds, if you will, to some ancient race that had somehow disappeared. And that's a clear and blatant insult to the capabilities of indigenous people.
I worked hand in hand with Gabe Overstreet on projects. Oh, it's been very good. Like I say, it's been with us for longer than I've been here as historic preservation and TIPO for the tribe. And he has gained the trust of not only our department, the TIPO office, but as the tribe as a whole.
One of the things that has really strengthened the relationship that I have with the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer came about on one of the past projects, a large excavation project that involved the Menominee tribe, was that he offered to come and smudge my crew. I came to understand that the reason for him wanting to do that was that we were working on a site about which there were stories about bad things happening. And we ultimately came to understand that he was not only concerned about the impact of that archaeological site and the potential impact of the community, but he was also concerned about the impact to the crew members that were working on that site, and was interested in our welfare as well as the tribal members' welfare. So I think that laid the groundwork for a relationship that grew steadily over the course of 15 years.
I think it's important for the Menominees to preserve what we have left. We've lost a lot. Our tribal history goes back thousands of years, and we have to tell that story of why we're still here. We've survived a lot of things. We survived the treaty era. We survived the boarding school experience. We have to tell that story, which we do. And we do that through oral history projects, through asking our elders what happened in the past. And we try to teach this in our schools.
When I was teaching at College of the Menominee Nation, we started a kind of a summer program, and we would work with high school students and spend time in the classroom. What we did was we taught kids how to convert metrics to English measures, and then we would do some work in calculating and map reading, and then go out in the field and actually visit sites. And they would participate in investigations on the reservation and outside of the reservation boundaries. And I think it gave those kids an opportunity to really become more immersed in their own heritage. And by and large, their response was very, very positive.
We have a youth culture camp. We have 2 camps every year. And within those camps, we teach language, culture, and traditions. The reason why we do that is to help young Menominees identify who they are as Menominee people. I think it's, for the Menominee people, we, as a sovereign government, sovereign nation, with the teaching of our culture, language, and traditions, we will be a sovereign nation in the future because of our language and our culture, and learning who we are and to identify us as Menominee people of the wild rice.